Welcome everyone to this final reframing event panel. I'm Anthony McCosker. I'm a professor of media and communication at Swinburne University and the chief investigator in the ADM+S Centre. For those who don't know me, I'm a research technology adoption and inequality, essentially, in a range of social and cultural contexts. I'm co-leading, amongst other things, a 3-year project in the ADM+S Centre on generative authenticity, which I think really works in this space of creativity and generative AI. And before I go on, a quick acknowledgement to the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, whose land I'm on, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And First Nations people of all of the places that we're dialing in from today. Thanks so much, Daniel, for the technology problem solving just then, and for designing and curating and managing this awesome event over the last 2 days. I've only been able to dip in and out, but it's been really rewarding and really amazing conversations for the bits that I have been able to join. And thanks for everyone sticking in the audience there in the room and online. And thanks very much to the panel for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel. I'm going to do this fairly quickly. We just heard from the amazing Everardo Reyes. We also have on the panel Kevin Witzenberger, who's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Gen AI lab at QUT and an ADM+S affiliate. We have Kylie Pappalardo, who's a senior lecturer at the law school at QUT and a chief investigator in the DMRC, Digital Media Research Centre, and an ARC DECRA fellow, which is a lot. We are also joined by Michael Richardson, who's an associate professor at the School of Arts and Media at University of New South Wales and co-director of the Media Futures Hub. He's also an associate investigator in the ADM+S Centre, where he's co-leading a number of signature projects, and I say a number in that kind of scary tone of that's a lot as well. To cap off this great reframing event, we're going to have a bit of a wide-reaching discussion around some of the big issues, or as we've put it, the wicked problems of the AI moment. And we'll be reaching across ethics, authenticity, intellectual property, and ecology. And those things don't seem to naturally sit together. They, of course, do when we're thinking about the huge impact that generative AI is having on the world. And we just want to explore this a little bit. Please do think about some questions that you have, but we're going to do this as a conversation, more or less. We might dip in and out of sharing screen, or we might not. We might just work through some questions. I'll have some questions for the panel, but yep, do think of questions if you have any as we go, and we can swing back and come back to particular points that are of interest and that are important. So I'm going to start with Everardo. Everardo, clearly our ideas about, it was fantastic to hear your presentation, by the way. Thank you. And I want to point everyone to Everardo's book, The Image Interface, fantastic book written a few years ago. But for you, clearly, our ideas about creativity and creative outputs are being reoriented by generative AI and synthetic media. And this is a good opportunity, I think, to think about the field of digital creative practice a little bit more broadly. Can you tell us a little bit about the big shifts in practice and experimentation that you're seeing in the field and how this is playing out? You mentioned SIGRA and you know the amazing huge amount of work that venue has brought to life over the years. But I'm particularly interested also in what you referred to as research creation. I won't use the French pronunciation because my French is just terrible, but it sounds so much better in French. But this idea of the potential around the creative research, pedagogy interaction, or that sort of intersection there.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I think that the notion is called practice-based research in some fields, or I have heard that wording of recherche-création here in France, which is a very, I would say, old, but at the same time recent in terms of institutionalization of the practice, right? We've been doing this since a long time ago, but it was, it has not been easy, right? I mean, in my personal context, of course, I am associate. I am a professor at University of Paris 8, and for those who are listening and who don't know what that means, is that Paris 8. That means that in Paris we have 13. Paris 8, Paris 1, 2, 3, 4, 13, and that happened because in '68 the Sorbonne was too big, that they split. And in '68, Paris 8 was created as an experimental center. And I'm telling you this because it's gonna make sense in a couple of minutes. So it was an experimental center, right, in the '68, and they said, well, you know, we're gonna put those, I would say, hippies outside center of Paris. We'll build them a campus in the woods, and they will go and do their own, whatever they want to do. So this experimental center was really open for all kind of public people, even ages. You could like follow a course on philosophy, even though you had a physicist background and things like that. And so it became famous. It was funded by one of a recognized philosopher here in France, Hélène Cixous, who she then hired another, perhaps another well-known philosopher, Michel Foucault. So they started this center, and then it got like bigger, and then the government said, well, you know, maybe you will need a more stable structure. And in the '80s, they moved the campus to where we are now in Saint-Denis, the northern of Paris. I think I'm telling this because it's been funny, difficult at the same time to say that we are doing this practice-based research, recherche-création. And when I arrived here, it felt the same spirit. It felt like Paris 8 was open to experimentation. Was one of the universities where I found multimedia, digital art, back on those days when I wanted to do a PhD. And I think that it was, I mean, thanks to this kind of experimental spirit that we were allowed in the first time. So, I mean, that's from my perspective, right? So what's happening now is that I think it's getting more institutionalized, and I think that has to do with what we call the materiality of media, that we have to not only think about the effects or the discourse analysis, but indeed in digital media, we have to use the media, right? What we have been doing today, Kevin doing a workshop, and I think it's everybody, it's not like in the '90s, like it was difficult to have a multimedia computer at home, perhaps, and today you can do ChatGPT in your phone, right? So I think that materiality, or I would say, yeah, materiality, because we want to do images, but we have to do it with a prompt, and if we want to do or to go beyond that, we need to do some code, or to go further into those layers, I would say. So yeah, that would be my
Yeah, fantastic. And we might come back to that idea of accessibility and the materiality of the media, because it is that layer of change that is really interesting everyone and driving these kind of conversations at the moment. Kevin, you're working in with an ADM+S team and with the QUT Gen AI lab around these questions of authenticity. And I know you've done an awesome workshop today there, and it would be great to talk a little bit more about these ideas. There are clearly technical and social approaches to addressing authenticity. So, and so much is happening so quickly that this idea is, in some senses unraveling somewhat. People are experimenting with both the creative or activist uses of generative AI, but also the kind of nefarious uses, the problematic uses of the technology. Where do you see these issues going? And I'd love to pick up on your idea of technical democracy. You're developing this idea, perhaps it's early days, I'm not sure. This idea of co-governance, a co-governance approach to generative AI applications. How are you thinking about this?
Thanks, Anthony. I have already tortured everyone for almost 2 hours on this authenticity kind of talk, so I'll keep that part short. But just to say, really, what I think is just great with this concept is it's an incredible vehicle to be talking about different technologies and kind of their impacts. So this is kind of really how I'm using it or understanding authenticity. Is it's a great vehicle to be talking about the lines of technology for different people. And when I say lines, I'm usually embedding all of this in this notion of controversy, which goes into this entire idea of technical democracy, or first controversies and then technical democracy, because controversies are really these moments of democratization when we have these big debates. But with AI, it's a bit different actually recently, because there was actually a great article that came out from Notya Maras on AI being a super controversy. It's too big, you can't really talk about it anymore. But then actually talking about authenticity in this context kind of narrows it down. And, there's no particular way of defining authenticity. It's actually a pretty kind of convoluted term. But in all these different domains that we can think of, authenticity plays out differently. Journalism talks about truth and all these sorts of different things. In research, we talk about other stuff. In education, we talk about, identification or authorship. We talk about, there's lots of different domains where you think about identification and cybersecurity. But that's why it's such a great vehicle. And it's really good to kind of see how controversies are driving this. And, there's a lot of ways that it's been now I'm going into technical democracy more as a concept, because there's a lot of ways to obviously regulate this, right? And there's a lot of kind of ideas from industry regulation, where we see kind of this authenticity as a service emerging, where you have oh no, we regulate ourselves. Here's a solution. We're kind of trying to preempt those controversies. But there's also stuff around, policy, where we have seen the AI Act coming out in Europe. We see similar stuff emerging in other jurisdictions. We have also things like user literacy, which is a very interesting governance mechanism, because it's about, what can people actually do? That goes both ways. And someone like Will, as you've seen earlier, can do stuff with these models that you're maybe not supposed to do. But also it goes the other way. And user engagement, and there's obviously different ways to regulate synthetic media environments. But so this is all very interesting, and part of a lot of this is part of this signature project of the ADM+S on generative authenticity. But what I find interesting about technical democracy is a bit of a different approach to controversies, and that's a term that's actually been developed by an STS scholar Michael Callan. On managing different levels of expertise to build a dam. That's where it kind of comes from initially. So how do you get all sorts of different knowledges every stakeholder who's involved in building a dam. We have like people who are like concerned about water supply. We have people who's concerned about energy production, but we also have farmers who might be interested or like, you know, concerned about land erosion, et cetera, et cetera. And so technical democracy can take different forms. And this is kind of like what I'm very interested in, is like creating these hybrid forums with different sorts of creators, where we're looking in very particular domains on how can you actually negotiate, you know, everyone's concerns, and that can be, for example, around authenticity. How can you negotiate these concerns? And the really cool thing about hybrid forums is that it's like, it's all about the language of, there's no hierarchy to like language of expertise, or like what kind of expertise we consider to be expertise, because it's really about finding common language through, I mean, they're calling it like collective forms of experimentation. And that's really about, you know, playing and you know, experimenting and, you know, using all sorts of different kind of tools. And yeah, so that's my work in this space.
Yeah, really interesting. And that idea of the crisis of expertise, which has actually been around for a while. I can't remember the name of the author of the book, The Crisis of Expertise, but it's a really awesome one. Kind of, so it predates generative AI, and I just want to pick up on this with you for a second, because I think it's really interesting. And the idea of the crisis of expertise actually comes out of our you know, risk culture and the kind of issues that we've seen emerge around mis and disinformation as part of that lowering of the trustworthiness of media. Do you think this is a really important part of that, I guess, super controversy, or, you know, the more narrow controversy of authenticity?
I'm not sure if I'm going to address this question in the right way, but what I find interesting of this crisis of expertise in that sense is that I find it very interesting to take a viewpoint where I don't actually you know, decide what expertise is and how it's being formulated. And we've seen a shift. So to give you context, I used to work more in the education space, where we've seen so much of expertise from outside in terms of computer science coming into the domain of education and making very authoritative claims on, you know, how education should be run. And that's just kind of you need to level the playing field. And I think that's how I understand my role as a researcher here. And
Yep.
I think that this, like, you know, building on this authenticity as a vehicle, you know, what do you think is authentic, without making a judgment, without, you know, having my own intervention in that sense, I think could be helpful for people.
Yeah, great. And that idea of leveling or at least shifting the boundaries around what are those kind of institutionalized senses of expertise or positions from which we speak, etc., and act. Great. And I think this is all a great segue to you, Kylie, underpinning all of these generative applications and reconfigurations are the kind of, I guess, traditional outputs and products of creative work, the kind of media that people have produced, uploaded, circulated online. There's been some recent issues around the Leon 5B data set that contains more than, what is it, 8.5 billion images, all scraped from the internet without consent, to train those kind of tools that we've been talking about, like Stability AI, Midjourney, etc., and other image generated tools. I think some of the controversy at the moment is that I think Human Rights Watch identified a handful, I think around 200 photos of Australian children in the mix, taken without their consent, and apparently embedded in websites that weren't even indexed by Google. So we don't even know, no one knows how they became part of that image sets. Anyway, just some context really, because there's a lot of rapid change taking place, and concern and anxiety among creators, producers of material that's online, that's now available, issues around and concerns around their rights as creators, their jobs, their reputation, their profession, and I guess the legal status of their work. What are some of the concerns that creators and right holders are expressing from your experience? And what do you think are the kind of mechanisms for guiding ethical practice in use of AI and Gen AI in particular? Sorry, big questions. Very big questions.
No, you're right. The generative AI has been massively, I guess, destabilizing for a lot of people, and it does raise a lot of these concerns, very legitimate concerns about what it means for the future of some people's work, what it means for their reputation, those sort of things. There are, of course, ethical and perhaps safety issues around AI, such as the example you just gave about images of children. But I might just put that to one side for now and just focus on the copyright aspects. I think that all of the concerns that creators have are very real. But I also feel like copyright law is a very bad fit for many of those concerns, because, as you said, these AI systems work by copying a whole bunch of stuff for the training data in the first place. It's quite easy to think that copyright is therefore the appropriate legal vehicle to deal with some of these concerns. But I think that most of the concerns are deeper. They're structural, they're societal, and they're kind of going to force us to grapple with how we in society actually value creative work in a way that goes beyond just whether does this have copyright or does this not have copyright. Because what Gen AI does in a copyright sense, which is really interesting, I think, is that it comes at a core principle in copyright law, which is what we call the idea expression distinction. And what this is that copyright law protects somebody's expression of their idea, right? So it protects the actual words that they have written out when they write a story, or it protects the actual artwork that they have painted. What it doesn't protect is the idea behind that artwork, the facts, the knowledge, the methods that go into that. And that's a really important distinction in copyright, because those are things that we agree as a matter of public policy ought to be made available for everybody to use and to learn from, right? Shakespeare doesn't get a monopoly for all of time over the story of star-crossed lovers, right? So what Gen AI does is this really funny thing where it kind of goes right to that idea expression dichotomy, and it asks us to kind of to reassess where we think there's a fair balance. Because even though the Gen AI systems are copying a lot of stuff in their training data, it's kind of this strange kind of copy, in that it's invisible, it's only ever looked at, the training data is only ever used by a machine, right? And then the things that the Gen AI models produce are not actually copies of expression. They are the kind of learning, right? We call it machine learning, where they're learning the way that people express things, the way that people talk about things, and then they are actually producing stuff at the other end that are not straightforward copies of that training data. So copies are being made, but they're not actually they're not actually copies of expression. They're kind of copies of the idea behind the expression, but at the same time, they're causing, at the same time, they're impacting creators as though they were copying the expression. So it kind of gets all messy. But I don't know that sort of making copyright law stricter is going to necessarily fix those problems. I think we need to grapple with some of those bigger questions about what is creativity and how do we value it and how do we fund it.
Yeah, that's the most amazing explanation of that I've heard so far, or read, or seen anywhere. So thank you, Kylie. I really appreciate that. Before I come to you, Michael, I just wanted to swing back to Everardo, if you don't mind. You were talking earlier about the kind of dialogic mode of visual media production. So it's this idea that Kylie's, I guess, referring to there, that the production whereas it maybe once was done by hand or by code, and in both circumstances there where the artist or producer is directly intervening into, you know, some sort of material interface or mode of expression that results in the product, the output, the artwork, whatever it is. What's happening here from your perspective in terms of the way that an artwork is being produced in dialogue, and how do you see that as affecting the idea, I guess, that sits behind the thing that you're trying to create?
Right. Well, that's a good question, and I do think that what I was listening to Kylie, that I mean the difference, or the fundamental difference when you go to the other part, to the other side, when you are not only consuming or reading the outcome of generative AI, but when you go into the production part, into the doing the things, I think that there are two possibilities, right? I mean, one is just to explore, one is just to experimenting, just like learning how these things work. The other is to have a more clear, let's say, objective or intention in the end. What I think is that when, from the creative part, right, from the side, from the perspective of a let's say a creative profile, I think that the interesting part is that there is I would put it in the sense of not trying to I would put it in the difference between trying to predict something. We can do AI to predict the weather, to predict if NFT or if Bitcoins will be the next thing, or we can do an AI to sell something that's still not, you know. Do you remember that in the early web, there were websites that were saying, well, check if you are pregnant or not, and that was online, and people were like even believing that that was possible just by, you know. And we can, I mean, one thing is to try to sell this kind of discourse, or let's say prediction or fake prediction, and the other is that from once again the creative perspective is that it's also thinking about what should be possible. I mean, one thing is to say, okay, I am using Instagram, Facebook, but what else? What can I do to add perhaps an ethical component, perhaps a multilingual component, multicultural, I don't know, whatever this enhancement module functionality could be. And I think that's when we really contribute, right, with something, I mean, concrete. When we have this, and I'm not saying that this has to be something that exists, right? I am saying that something that could possibly be indeed factually done. I mean, it doesn't have to be, I mean, we talk about prototypes, we talk about blueprints, sketches, and I think that would be the difference. I mean, that would be, I mean, the good use of using or going into the production of media.
Yeah, look, to me, an undercurrent here is the role of that technology plays in capabilities, in enabling capabilities for people, for whatever ends. And I think what you're alluding to, pointing to, is that thing that these tools are, or that set of capabilities, I guess, that these tools are opening up and creating and enabling in that sense. And to me, I think we are touching on somewhere between that set of concerns and issues that we have, that we call the ethical issues of these technologies of AI, and what you referred to, Kylie, as the value, you know, how we value the kind of outputs and the tools and the systems and the enormous models that are actually getting us there, or allowing us to create and play and experiment and produce and to collaborate in new ways. So that's a kind of snaky way of getting to you, Michael, and the question of ecology here and ecosystems. And I know this is potentially drawing a long bow, but we know that, I mean, this comes up all the time, the enormous but not very well understood ecological impacts of AI. And I think it's part of this balance of what do we value, what's enabled, what do we want to restrict, what do we value in the production of these systems and generation and use of these systems. It's an issue that comes up as a potential blocker. And I actually always think about the critiques of blockchain, and Everardo, you just mentioned NFTs as well. But the critiques of blockchain technologies were absolutely about, you know, that enormous energy requirement and expenditure of fossil fuel in order to enable those kind of systems. Michael, you're co-leading an exciting project around automated decision-making systems, ecosystems, and multi-species relationships. Can you tell us a little bit about what the conceptual approach of the project is? And I'm also keen to hear about the ADM+ ecosystems playbook, if I got that right, in terms of what it looks like to try to intervene in practices and policies from your perspective. And I think there's some crossover in terms of the sort of regulatory approaches as well as creative and practice approaches.
Thanks, Anthony. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I wasn't able to actually be down there with you for what sounds like it's been a really terrific event. I'm speaking to from unceded Bidjigal country here in Sydney. So our concern around ecology and ecosystems and automated systems, including, and I think today especially Gen AI and AI and data centers and so on more generally, has really been that you know, we tend to understand ecological impacts in relatively narrow terms. You know, for example, we might think about like how much energy is used to query a search engine, or to ask ChatGPT to generate an answer for you, or Midjourney to produce an image, or whatever it might be, right? And we could extend that to thinking about impacts of water usage in cooling data centers, for example. And we know too, though, that there's a whole sort of supply chain impact ecologically for all forms of technology, but for AI in particular, there are specific supply chain impacts that relate to the movement of bits and pieces of computer parts all over the world, to the rare earth minerals that are required to produce many of them, through to the industrial processes for producing silicon chips and so on and so forth. And so there's actually a really big ecological question to examine that goes beyond like how efficient is the is a particular model in producing an answer for you. And like, it's really good to see actually that like big tech companies take that latter question quite seriously. And so, you know, Microsoft, OpenAI, take your pick, they're all working to reduce the amount of energy that they're using on individual query outcomes. Of course, that's also happening alongside a massive expansion in the number of queries that are taking place. And so, you know, so even with those sort of commitments to increased efficiency around particular queries or to, you know, net zero objectives of large tech companies and so on, they are really in tension with the rapid expansion of the use of these types of systems. And that's just on the domain that we're normally talking about, which is like how much energy is used or how much water or whatever. And beyond those questions of supply chain, of like how do the systems get made, there's also the question of what happens when things become defunct. Data centers have a very short shelf life, actually, and equipment needs to be upgraded all the time. This is part of the business model of AI, of course, is actually continual need to upgrade. NVIDIA wants to sell more and more GPUs, right? So the ones that they have already sold need to become obsolete in order to justify those sales. Okay, so and then so what happens after a data center is no longer at optimal capacity and can't meet industry standards? Well, do the materials in there get recycled, and how do they get put in landfill? Does the data center actually just get like closed up and another one gets built with new equipment in it because it's actually too expensive to deal with the problem of the obsolete data center? So there's a question about ecological impact that extends far beyond the particular energy uses around a query, and we're wanting to try and work out, well, how do we think about that, and what are the kind of concepts and lines of inquiry that are required to better understand all of that in a holistic way. But the other dimension of ecological impact is in the transformation of human relationships with more than human ecologies and with other species and so on. And so we could think of a bunch of ways that AI systems are really beneficial around conservation, for example, like they can do large scale tracking of bush regrowth, for example. They can help with tracking endangered species in certain kinds of contexts and so on. So there's like a bunch of benefits that we can see for AI in those particular areas, but it's also being applied in ways that shift our relationship in a really everyday sense with other species. So you could think about using AI tools to identify birds. A step change perhaps from like a birding guide, right? But nevertheless, like these small ways in which like our mediation of the world of life beyond us gets shifted and shaken up by these types of tools. We could also think too, I guess, coming back to the kind of question of kind of creativity and invention that Everardo and Kylie were getting at, and ask, well, what sort of new forms of species imaginary or species invention or notions of the connection between human and the non-human or the human and the more than human might arise through the way these sort of these systems intervene in the process of creativity or of invention or synthesis or appropriation or whatever, however we might want to term them. So we're sort of trying to move the project in these two dimensions: ecological impact, but also transformations of relation with the ecological. And just briefly on the ADM+E playbook, or the automated decision making in ecologies playbook, we're kind of one question that arises from all of this is like, okay, so what? Like, you develop a more holistic and integrated sense of the ecological impacts of AI, and if it is a kind of super crisis or super emergency or a super controversy, was it the Nochimara
super controversy?
Thing? Yeah, super controversy. Well, like one way of understanding that is, well, then it's like such a big problem and so difficult to engage with that, like, well, what do you actually do? And so the what do you actually do question is one we want to try and help a little with. And so the idea that we have is to develop a kind of playbook that could be used by organizations, but particularly we're hoping, mid-sized entities like local governments and so on, who might have a bunch of ideas about how they want to implement an automated system, an AI system, for example, but not really have a good understanding of the kinds of questions they should necessarily be asking about their own processes, or about or to the suppliers that they're talking to, or the developers they want to employ, or whoever it is. And so we're wanting to develop something that's sort of dynamic and flexible and scalable across different types of institutions, about that, particularly for Australia, actually, where entities could ask, like, could think, okay, we're wanting to implement an AI system. We also have all of these commitments to green objectives and carbon reduction objectives and so on. And so how are we going to reconcile those things, and what questions should we be asking, and how might the questions that we ask, or the things that the problems that arise from us, how do those relate to particular strands of academic research, and how can we back up our kinds of concerns and queries with deeper insight? So you could imagine, a organization for whom a bunch of ecological questions do not apply. So it would be great if they could have an easy way of eliminating a bunch of queries that they don't need to pursue, but then also for ones that they do need to pursue, be able to dig a little deeper into academic research, for example, that might help them understand, say, certain legal implications in relation to the ecological impacts of a system, or have examples, or link to examples of studies that have looked at the implications of a particular type of system in a different context that might provide some additional background and light. So we're sort of seeing it as a sort of dynamic and connective interface, or handbook, I guess. But we're hoping to really go beyond the just another PDF type of model, and have something that's a little bit more interactive and dynamic. But that's still in the early stages at this point.
Of course, fantastic, and it actually just made me think about a local council that I've been working with, who tried to introduce an AI-driven system to create efficiencies, to reduce its impact on the environment, and to literally reduce the carbon emissions in traversing the council in terms of its maintenance work, but didn't think at the same time about the environmental impacts of the systems that they were using, that were enormously data intensive. The data storage, the movement, the energy that's involved in all aspects of that work, until they'd already spent $2 million on the system and the processes. So this kind of playbook idea, I think, is actually fantastic in plugging into that. And one other thing that this just made me think about in terms of the kind of macro, supply chain issues and cost of AI systems on the ecosystem and environment. I had conversations with the amazing CEO of an organization, Indigenous First Nations organization called Land on Heart, who have been looking at ways of, I guess, supporting the kind of micro level care for country through the use of AI, in particular, trying to bring together the enthusiasm that young people in community and remote communities have for technology, with processes and practices of learning country, but also inserting knowledge into the AI ecosystem in terms of biodiversity, and improving, the potential for care for country. And it was a really good, interesting example of that layering of processes that could come back to supporting new ways of doing that kind of care in the micro sense. I'm just conscious of time, and we did have to push back because of our technical concerns. But I wanted to open up to questions, first of all, amongst our panel, because I think you guys might have a few questions that you have of each other. And then we have, I think, some questions in the Q&A and potentially in the room, which I'll throw to Daniel for. Everardo?
Yeah, I do have a question for you and Michael, indeed, because I've been learning a lot, and you have been talking about many other resources, books, that it would be fantastic if we can, I don't know, Daniel, if we can, augment or put them in the bibliography or references that there are in the website. There is this part, right, which is called the reading list.
Yeah, there's a reading list. Absolutely.
Yeah, it would be great, because I wanted to know more about what the playbook that Michael was preparing. And the other thing about the species is that you made me remember that there are some initiatives by some artists, designers about speculative species. I will put them in the book, in the reading list. Of course, there is a bestiary of Anthropocene by Nicholas Nova and Disnovation. And there is another, a colleague of mine, Ilan Manuash, who wrote Chimeras, an inventory of synthetic cognition. It's an open book by Onassis in Greece. I can show them. But I do think that, okay, as we were discussing a bit before, one thing is and I'm not saying anything, predicting and saying, yes, speculative, this could happen without actually proposing anything concrete. But in the other side is this book called An Immense World by Ed Young. He wrote a book about how animals perceive the world in a very scientific manner, but also very accessible manner. Of course, we know flies, how we can imagine how flies see, but these are very, there's a variety of different senses, right? So what, at some point I wanted to do, and I did a small work, but takes a lot of time, of course, then you need to work with teams, is at some point some discussions are, okay, so trying to design or to do stuff from the perspective of other species, trying to communicate how does the climate change affects other species, how does it feel too, sometimes is a question perhaps to start.
I could give a bit of a reading list, but maybe better added to the one that Dan is perhaps compiling. I'm really interested in this question of what it means to have knowledge across species, but also what it means to have knowledge between humans and machines, for instance, and how we sort of think about that knowledge. I've just written a book of my own, actually, that came out this year that touches on these questions in a certain dimension called non-human witnessing. It's the name of the book. But yeah, I think that we're sort of confronted with this problem actually across a bunch of super controversies and or whatever we want to call them, crises, interlocking crises. I think, climate crisis and AI. We could think too of transformations in the way war is fought, and a bunch of other things the sort of seeming decline of democracy across the world, etc. A sort of political fraying and so on is confronting us with this question of how do we know together, and how do we share knowledge in ways that are powerful, meaningful, can be agreed upon, but also accept that we actually don't all share precisely the same perception of the world. And in fact, I think we actually live in a world of many worlds, which is what Marisol de la Cadena and Mario Blazer, how Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena describe things. And I think that like idea of like a world of many worlds requires us to sort of reorient knowledge and to think differently about how knowledge is produced or creativity is done or witnessing takes place, or like how communication occurs, like take your pick, right? And I think we need to do that across a host of different domains. And I think one of the things that's exciting actually about this sort of AI moment is that it's sort of forcing people to confront that across so many different facets of life. And I think in some ways that's because of the scale of the controversy, but in other ways it's also because of the way it prompts us to sort of really think in a different way about our relationship to technology and to what it does in processes of creation, or to authenticity, or to our relation to environment and so on. And so, I think that like there's as a sort of critical scholar, I think there's a huge place for critique in that, but I also think there's a huge place for exploring what's happening in practice, whether that's like artistic practice or whether it's like, the kinds of work that First Nations groups are doing around, I'm being presented with a carrot. If anyone would like a carrot, there we go. I think that in that we're sort of we have to take seriously what's going on in initiatives like that, First Nations one that you mentioned, Anthony. I'm sorry, the name of the organization slipped my mind, because I think those things require us to go, well, like what does an AI system and AI forms of knowledge making enable for different ways of caring for country, for instance, and like. I think it's important as academics to cast our critical eye on things, but also not to throw everything out simply because we don't like a particular type of technology in a particular kind of context.
Sure.
And it's a banal statement in some ways, I guess, but I do think it's important. It's important to I find I have to remind myself of that often, because otherwise you end up in a sort of circular situation.
Yeah, for sure. And just to add, and sorry, just quickly to add, the issue of monocultures in foundational models, they're huge, and they're being produced by big corporations that create a level of monoculture, and it's pushing back against that. That's part of that process.